A Queen of England who was left unburied for around 400 years had her remains desecrated daily by those inside one of England's most ornate and grand churches. Catherine of Valois is remembered in the canon of English history as a forgotten medieval queen, and she would reign for a short period as a queen consort to her husband, Henry V. This would only last for around 2 years, as her husband then died, but she would give birth to the heir and successor Henry VI, who came onto the throne himself at a very young age. But her remains following her death were left in the open inside of Westminster Abbey, and visitors would even kiss a decaying corpse of a medieval queen. The famous writer Samuel Pepys did this, and he would state, "On Shrove Tuesday 1669 I to the Abbey went, and by favour did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of her body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth. Reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen, and this my birthday, and I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen." But what is the true horrific story behind the unburied Queen of England, left to rot for 4 centuries? As always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Catherine of Valois was the youngest daughter of the King of France, Charles VI, and there were early negotiations for Catherine to marry the future King Henry V. Henry V himself was a victor of Agincourt, and during the 100 Years' War he was a heroic warlord. Henry V would then plan to marry the French princess, and it was hoped that their children would go on to rule England and France for some time. But Catherine was a beautiful young lady, and between the two nations a peace agreement was signed, along with the acknowledgement that Catherine's future husband, the King of England, would also be the heir to the French throne. Catherine would then travel across the English Channel to come to her new kingdom, and she would be crowned as Queen at Westminster Abbey on the 23rd of February 1421. Henry V, her husband, continued to fight on in France, and whilst Henry was away, Catherine would give birth to the future King Henry VI. But Henry V would never see his son, as he would become sick whilst in France, and he would die there shortly before Catherine of Valois' 21st birthday. She was now a widow living in a foreign country, but she became known as a Queen Dowager. However, following Henry V's death, Catherine of Valois, the French princess, was seen as a wanted lady by many important and influential English nobles. They thought that if they became the stepfather of the King of England and France, then they would have a huge amount of power. But Catherine would then marry Owen Tudor, the grandfather of the future Henry VII, and together they had a number of children. However, on the 3rd of January 1437, after giving birth again, Catherine of Valois died. It is considered that she may have been sick for some time, as she would visit Bermondsey Abbey in London to pray for her health, but this did very little. 3 days before her death she made her will, and she would then be given a huge funeral fit for a queen. The scandal with her second marriage may have caused some chaos at the time, but she was given a dignified funeral, but her remains were treated terribly. After her death, Catherine of Valois would be embalmed after she died, and then to keep away decay, her internal organs were cut out and removed. The cavity of her was then stuffed with herbs and spices, and her body was wrapped in a cerecloth. This was a heavy wax-coated cloth, and her remains were then encased in lead, and it was put inside of a wooden coffin. Her internal organs were buried elsewhere, as was tradition. They would be buried in places close to her heart, but it's believed that Catherine of Valois had her internal organs buried at places where the funeral procession stopped in certain churches. But then her first funeral took place at St Catherine's Church, but then a second one would occur at Westminster Abbey. With the funeral procession, an effigy of Catherine of Valois was placed on top of the coffin, and this had been carved from wood, and it looked very realistic. It was also dressed in Catherine's clothes, and the coffin was also covered in a cloth of gold, and she was then placed inside an alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey, close to the remains of her first husband, King Henry V. This tomb would only be for a temporary basis, as when her son Henry VI was older, he wanted to commission a large memorial and tomb for her, but he would die in suspicious circumstances inside of the Tower of London, presumably murdered. But Henry VII would then demolish the Old Lady Chapel, where she had been buried, and Catherine's tomb was then destroyed, and her body was then taken out of the tomb. The outer wooden coffin in which she had been placed in was found to have been decayed, and her remains and body had been taken out of this, and it was then removed from the inner lead-lined coffin. And it was then placed inside a wooden chest, and this was covered with flat sheets of lead on top which had been taken down from the roof of the chapel. The chest was then placed at the feet of Henry V's tomb, and it would have been planned to have been reburied near there. But this never happened, and she was left unburied for over 300 years. But Henry VII could have ordered her tomb to have been destroyed intentionally, to distance himself from his grandfather Owen Tudor, but he would then claim he would want to be laid to rest amongst the queens, including Catherine of Valois. However, the new Lady Chapel in Westminster Abbey, which was hoped to have been a new Tudor mausoleum used for centuries, with kings and queens buried inside of, was not finished during Henry VII's life, as he died before this was completed. But his son Henry VIII never reburied Catherine of Valois, who was actually his great-grandmother. But her body was then left above ground inside of Westminster Abbey, and her chest in which her body was placed had 2 lids, and visitors for a small fee would ask to be shown her remains and body. One witness said he pulled back the cerecloth covering her face, and they said that the bones being firmly united and thinly clove like flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather. But many said her skin and body had no clothes on it, and that Catherine had been actually buried naked in her shroud, then this was displayed. Many tour guides inside of the abbey made some money from tourists by showing them the remains of the Queen, and as mentioned, people did touch her body, would pick it up and even hug it, and as mentioned, even kiss it as Samuel Pepys did. At the time in which he did this, she had been dead for around 200 years. But the mistreatment and desecration of Catherine of Valois' body continued, and it was said that a group of young students had torn her body into pieces, and had caused it to become a shapeless mass of whitish colour. But she would then be left in the abbey for even longer, and her remains were left inside of the Villiers vault, but then Queen Victoria would, during her reign, give permission to try and find the remains of Catherine of Valois inside of Westminster Abbey. But the remains of Catherine were then found on top of a pile of coffins beneath an effigy, and her coffin had fallen against a damp wall and had rotted. The people inside Westminster Abbey tried to pick this up, but it fell to pieces, and it was found that someone had tampered further with the Queen's body, as parts of her remains were missing. Some historians said that these had been covered with lime, and that some of her body had been consumed by the quicklime. But the front part of her skull had been taken, and there was one part of the back of her skull found on her pelvis. Many of the vertebrae were missing, and there was only 1 rib left, and 2 of her right arm bones remained. Her teeth were also missing, and it's believed these were taken as souvenirs. The legs of the Queen were said to have been in a perfect condition, as they had been covered with 12 layers of cerecloth, and they were preserved well. Some of the skin on her right arm remained also. But inside of the coffin under her head were the remains of a pillow, but then her remains were interred for a final time. One witness who saw this procession and ceremony stated that it was a striking and impressive scene, which I shall ever remember, and which at the time is impossible to view without some feeling of emotion. The daylight had quite faded, and we were alone in the darkened abbey. 2 workmen took up the box containing the Queen's remains, and followed Mr. Poole and the clerk of the works, the latter carrying in his one hand 1 small lantern to lighters, led the way out of St. Nicholas's Chapel to the north side of the Chantry Chapel. Mr. George Sharp and myself followed. No one else was present, and we seemed unconsciously and silently to fall in a sort of processional order. I remarked to him, "We're attending the Queen's 3rd funeral." Not a word was said as we slowly passed round the ambulatory into the darkness. Catherine of Valois' body was placed inside of a thick oak coffin, and the pieces of the old chest were placed in the new one. But 400 years later, Catherine of Valois finally was given a burial of a queen amongst the monarchs of Britain, and throughout the years her remains have been treated awfully. They were desecrated and abused, and some of her remains were taken by souvenir hunters. But Catherine of Valois was the wife of the famous Henry V, the man who was a hero of Agincourt, but she would marry the English king, and it was hoped that the 2 nations would be united under their marriage. She would also be the great-grandmother of the notorious King Henry VIII. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.